Hail the Tamarian vessel.
Aye, Captain.
Cinder! His face black, his eyes red.
Tamak. The river Tamak. In winter.
Darmok.
And Jalad. At Tanagra. Darmok and Jalad. On the ocean.
So Koth, his eyes open.
The beast of Tanagra. Uzani, his army. Shaka, when the walls fell.
Picard and Dathan at Eladriel. Marab with sails unfurled.
Temba, his arms open.
Timber at rest.
Thank you.
Power has been restored, sir.
New friends, Captain?
Can't say, number one. But at least they're not new enemies.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that little clip. That is actually one of the most famous language clips as it pertains to pop culture in basically the U.S. That clip or one of the other clips from that episode is filmed and shown in most, probably not all, but certainly most classes on linguistics. In that species, maybe you could tell, everything related to stories. That's how they communicated. Of course, it's very interesting if you didn't already know the story. But that brings us, that's a good opening to this whole concept of language. And the discussion question is, how does language set humans apart from lower animals? You may also wish to think about, what do you know about how other animals communicate? Generally, there's a lot of things that we still do not know about animal communication, and there is some stuff that we have established over time. We have learned that there are many animals that have a much more complex communication, if not language system, than we thought, including chimps, dolphins. We all know that they communicate, and it would appear that some of them actually can pass on some rather complex ideas. One of the things that we've always assumed has put us apart from others has been this concept of abstract thought. At least that's what we believed, and nowadays things are really challenging that real idea. So we're going to start with stuff like true or false, information about this. True or false, there are over 6,000 languages in the world, and 200 of which are artificial. True or false? The answer is true. There are actually about 7,000 languages, with a fair amount of them actually in danger. Something like 300 of them are endangered at the time of this recording. A language goes extinct about every 2 weeks or so. True or false? Pinocchio is the second most translated book in the world. The answer is true. Something about Pinocchio is very popular, and It's very frequently translated. The most popular, the most translated book in the world is the Christian Bible. Language originated around 100,000 BC. True or false? The answer is it's true. It's somewhere between a little bit around 90,000 plus. At a certain point, it does get a little bit more challenging to figure out exactly when things are, but we do know it's at least 90,000, around 90,000 BC or so. Chinese speakers use both sides of their brain, while English speakers primarily use just the left side. True or false? If you said true, you're correct. English primarily does focus in just the one area, while the Chinese speakers do tend to use both sides of their brain. This is in part due to their tonal language. Hawaiians have about 200 words for rain. This would be true. Just like some people say that there are several words for snow in some of the Inuit languages, snow and ice. Apparently in the native Hawaiian language, there's 200 or so different ways to describe rain types. Cryptophagia is the language between twins. True or false? True. It also can be between triplets. You don't even have to be identical twins, triplets, whatever. You can be fraternal. Just they've got, and they can start having conversations with each other, you know, an hour old or so. A lot of people, you know, think kids aren't starting to talk, and you know, until they're, you know, basically, you know, a year old or whatever. But they're definitely communicating. A bilingual person is more likely to think rationally in their first language than their second. True or false? If you said false, you're correct. They're actually more likely to think rationally in their second language than their first. Some languages express themselves in double negatives, which form a positive. That is, of course, true. You can see stuff like that, for example, in French. But this also leads into my joke, so be scared. A linguistics professor says during a lecture that in English, a double negative forms a positive. But in some languages, such as Russian, a double negative is still a negative. However, in no language in the world can a double positive form a negative. But then a voice from the back of the room piped up, yeah, right. Ba-dum-bum. So, language is a very complicated topic, and it's definitely not one of my areas. My last linguistics course was
language
over 20 years
probably
ago
the hardest problem in
my
science.
anthropology training.
Nobody really knows how it
not
works,
the best, honestly,
and nobody really
about
knows
dealing
where it
with
came from.
languages or
And
language
yet we can all
origins
do
or
it.
anything like that. But
I think
did
it's a
want
bit
to
like
at least
driving a
share
car. We can
from somebody
drive a
who
car, but
probably
we
knows
don't really
a whole
know
lot
how the
more than I
machine
do.
works.
What they say, this is a TED
One
Talk
of the things
about the
that makes language unique, I think, is that we can generate new sentences all the time. There's an infinite capacity to say something different. In this talk, you will probably hear some sentences you've never heard before, yet I hope you can understand them. Animal language, or animal communication, on the other hand, is mostly repetitive, automatic, and emotional, and doesn't create new meanings. The English comedian Stephen Fry once uttered the following sentence: "Hold the newsreader's nose squarely, waiter, or friendly milk will countermand my trousers." That sentence, I think he was confident in believing, had never been uttered before, and I'm happy to repeat it here in case you need it. To compound the problem, there are something like 6,000 different languages in the world, most of them impenetrable to any other. So most people will speak one or maybe two languages, or perhaps four or five, but there are well over 5,000 languages that will be totally impenetrable to you. If I were to do this talk in Bantu or Navajo, or perhaps even Portuguese, you wouldn't understand what I'm saying. So that's an added problem. How can there be so many languages, each of them impenetrable to all of the others? Any child, though, can learn any one of those languages, provided they start early enough. So that's a paradox. Any kid can learn any one of them, yet most of us only learn one or two of them. Okay, now, how are we to solve that problem? The common solution is that language is a miracle, a miraculous thing that happened all at once. That comes from the Bible, the Old Testament. According to the Old Testament, the Lord gave language to Adam. The people then grew proud, and they built the Tower of Babel in an attempt to get closer to heaven. But the Lord was a vengeful God, and he destroyed the tower. The people scattered, and so did the languages. And that is the biblical account why we have so many languages. Now, the foremost linguist of our time is Noam Chomsky, who's made actually considerable contributions to how we put language together. But his notion of how language evolved, I think, is positively biblical. What he thinks is that roughly 90,000 years ago, mutation happened in one individual. He doesn't call that individual Adam, he calls that individual Prometheus, for some reason, known to him. And from there, it spread to all other people and eventually created all the languages of the world. That's a biblical story, really, because it says language happened in a single individual once with a single mutation of some sort, and I don't think it makes biological sense. There is a representation of the last 7 million years of human evolution since we separated from the great apes. Humans are right on the very right-hand end of that, a tiny blip in the last 7 million years. We evolved, it seems, about 200,000 years ago. And according to Chomsky, language only emerged with about halfway through that span of 200 million years. Sorry, 200,000 years. And I'll show you that. That's where the miracle happened. And to me, that doesn't make much sense because you've got all those millions of years of human evolution from when we decided not to be great apes anymore. That it would be offensive, I think, to Charles Darwin, although he's not still around to complain. He argued that any complex organ, like language, or like the liver, or the heart, or the brain, must have evolved through successive, numerous, slight modifications. And if anybody could find an exception to that, that would destroy his theory of evolution. But Chomsky's theory then might be that one case. And if Chomsky is right, then evolutionary theory would be destroyed in Darwin's own terms. Now, I want to try and demonstrate to you that language didn't arise from vocal calls, it arose from gestures. That language started from making gestures. And I put one hand in my pocket so that I won't demonstrate too volubly, but I've still got one I can wave around. One piece of evidence for that actually comes from the monkey brain. And that takes us back about 30 or 40 million years in terms of a common ancestor. There's an area, a circuit in the monkey brain that is dedicated to making grasp actions, to reaching out and picking things up. It's called the mirror system because that system is active whenever the monkey reaches out for something or when it sees another animal or person even reaching out and making the same movement. So it maps what the monkey sees onto what the monkey can do. Some people have called it a monkey see, monkey do circuit. Now, it turns out that the equivalent circuit in the human brain is the language circuit, and you'll see that on the slide there. So that's the language areas in the brain seem to have arisen from this mirror circuit in the monkey brain. So in the course of evolution, that circuit seems to have been taken over, or at least used, partly to deal with language. Now, moving forward a bit in evolution towards ourselves, no one has ever been able to teach a great ape to talk or come anywhere near it. Then people had the idea that maybe we can teach them to sign, to gesture. And there have been a number of cases, I've shown a couple of them there, in which quite reasonable conversations have been had between humans and apes by use of sign language or something like it. So they can ask or make simple requests and be understood, and the person can respond and have a little conversation. It's not a very good conversation in many ways. They can't sort of tell you what they did yesterday or gossip about each other, but they can make requests and make little sentences that are somewhat generative in the way that human language is. Another famous case is this is Kanzi, who's a bonobo. And Kanzi uses a kind of an iPad, I guess, but it's a display of symbols. And he points to these symbols. They represent objects and actions. So he can also ask for things and have little conversations with one of his helpers there, as you will see. So that shows you, I think, that in great apes, they come closer to language by using either pointing to something or using a form of sign language. It's now also known, and this has become a hot topic recently, that if you look at apes in the wild, they make lots and lots of gestures that seem much more language-like than their vocalizations are. So they're much more flexible. As you can see there, some of them you can almost recognize what they're trying to say. The one on the top left there is quite interesting. It's asking to be, I'm sorry, that's actually grooming. I think the one on the bottom left is asking to be groomed in that spot. So the ape will sometimes point to a part of the body, it wants some other animal to come along and scratch. And you can see a bit of a gossip session there on the bottom right. Now, it's also moving forward to humans. We know, of course, that sign language is purely gestural. It's done silently. It's done with gestures of the hands, of course, but it's also done with gestures of the face. So that's a powerful argument, I think, that language at least can be purely gestural and just as effective as speech. We now know that sign language is linguistically sophisticated. It uses the same brain areas that spoken language does. And there's a university in the United States called Gallaudet University, which in fact uses only sign language in all its classes, even when it teaches poetry. So there are forms of poetry in sign. Now, we all gesture as we speak. There's me gesturing. I didn't put my hand in my pocket then, but I still had one hand free, and I was gesturing a bit while I was talking. But in the background, you will see there's somebody translating me into sign. So that person is making somewhat similar gestures as I was making while I was gesturing while I was talking. So that does show somewhat of a correspondence between signing, I think, and speaking. There's another picture of me gesturing, and you might notice if you look carefully that my colleagues there look extremely bored. Now, I apologize if I'm doing that to you. And one of them has actually died, you will notice. No, I think the critical thing that happened between us and apes was bipedalism. So at some point in human evolution, beginning really when we switched from apehood, and we gradually became more and more upright, and that, of course, freed the hands and the face for a gestural kind of communication, and that's where I think it began to become sophisticated. So we began to be able to create meanings by combining gestures in various ways. I think it probably developed into a form of mime, so that people began to mime things they wanted to talk about, either something that they'd seen on their expeditions and hunter-gathering or whatever, or maybe what they planned to do tomorrow, or maybe even gossip about it to each other in gestural form, mimicking each other. So I think it probably began as a language-like thing beyond what apes can do from around about 6 or 7 million years, but beginning especially, I think, about 6 million years ago, as I'll try to demonstrate. So there's our picture again of hominin evolution. That's ourselves from about 7 million years ago. It's a bit tragic, of course, that all of them, there are about 20 different hominin species there that are beyond the apes, and they've all become extinct with one exception. And that's, again, that tiny little blip called Homo sapiens on the right. So be careful out there on the street, because all of our other cousin species are no longer with us. Okay, so what happened then is there was increasing bipedalism through that period, and we probably became fully bipedal about 2 million years ago. And that gives us much more canvas to play on if we try to understand how our language actually came about. It makes more sense, I think, than supposing there was a sudden mutation 90,000 years ago that suddenly gave us language. That, to me, makes no biological sense. I should add, by the way, that the idea that there was a sudden event is widely held, not just by Chomsky, by a lot of archaeologists, although most biologists I talk to think it doesn't make sense. Okay, now then you might ask, why 6,000 languages? So what happened, I think, in that course? We started out by kind of miming, but then it became less iconic and more arbitrary. So language became simplified. So it kind of gradually lost its pictorial component. It's more efficient to reduce the symbols that we use with our hands into something that's more conventional or decided by people arbitrarily than it is to try to make them mimic what it is that you see out there. So there's more room for variation. So I think as people scattered, it came out of Africa about 90,000 years ago, scattered around the world, the languages that they use adapted to geography and culture and religion, perhaps. So that's why these things all became different. Now, they became more different than you might expect, because I think that's because we partly design language to keep other people out, so that people won't understand us. So language is not only a means of communicating, it's a means of preventing communication. It's a kind of a fortress that we build around us, a silo, if you like. So that's, in a way, the downside of language, and especially speech, where it can be quite arbitrary, where you decide what sounds will correspond to what things. Just to recap then, I'm maintaining here that language started with a grasping reflex, as you see on the left, kind of genuinely communicative acts by great apes, through to something like Homo erectus, who probably has a much more sophisticated way of signing, and perhaps the beginnings of grunts and things that were turned into speech, but also the beginnings of tools. So I think as we lost the manual component, then what happened was we freed up the hands a second time. The first freeing of the hands was bipedalism, but then as language began to develop, gesturally, we began to lose the manual component again and put the thing in the face. So language becomes more dedicated to the face, which is also a very expressive organ, and eventually, I think we put it into the mouth, which is a brilliant idea, really. It's the first example, I think, of miniaturization, where the whole thing, instead of having to move your whole body around as you communicate, it's tucked away neatly into the mouth and frees up the hands for doing other things, and in particular, for making things. Okay, now, I think it didn't stop there. Obviously, language didn't stop with speech. We have developed many more different forms of language since we decided to speak, and each of those changes, including speech itself, has been of enormous importance to our species, I think, and it's a growing importance. It starts perhaps with reading and writing, which adds a dimension. For a start, it gives language memory. So once you start writing things down, then they become permanently.
So that he actually goes on for another few minutes, but this is the bulk of his information about language origins and evolutions. Certainly much more up to date than probably what I could have provided. So as we might realize, of course, at this point that pretty much everyone uses language. Even babies from just, a few hours old, they're already attempting to use some form of communication. A lot of animals use communication. Basically, really everyone does use something, even if you might not understand it. There are many forms of language. Of course, we know oral, written languages. Of course, there's also something to be said for body language. And something like 90% of our communication is actually expressed through the body language rather than anything else. You can tell this, in animals as well. You might not always be able to understand what they're saying, but you can pretty much understand what they're communicating. Some of the important factors as to how we really understand language is this whole concept of, common ground and shared knowledge. As we saw in that clip from Star Trek, you can imagine at the beginning of this, before they realized everything was a story, the universal translator found this language being the only one that could not easily be translated. It really couldn't be translated at all, because all of this truly was built on that shared knowledge and common ground. This is, of course, a very, very extreme version of it in that situation. But let's give maybe a little bit simpler example. It's common ground for shared knowledge. So if I say something like to you, oh, your project is due next week, well, you have to understand a few things. One, you have to understand project. The project 3 is due next week. You have to understand what the concept of a week is, and you certainly have to. The main thing really probably should be the whole concept of the project. A lot of us already understand what the concept of a week is. But if I said to a colleague, project 3 is due next week, referring to your project 3, that would that's not really telling them a whole lot. It's telling them that something's due next week, a project, but he doesn't know what project 3 is. He can't tell them what exactly is to be communicating, what we're really communicating. Okay, what's project 3 about? Well, project 3 is on development. They would need further information to be able to really express that. Now, that's very different than if I tell that to you guys, who probably are already aware about the projects and everything else. You also have to, when you are doing this communication, is this concept of the audience design and knowledge. A big thing here relates to your word choice. And certain words you may have to change depending on your audience. This can be stuff like just things that your own group is aware. It could also be situations like jargon or selected word choice. Really. So if I'm communicating with an English person, an English major, and I'm referring to the play Macbeth, well, quite frankly, I'm probably going to deal with calling it Macbeth. If I talk to a theater person, however, I'm not. I'm probably going to say the Scottish play. I'm not going to use it. Just refer to it as Macbeth. The cursed play. Now, without the knowledge of what this whole thing is, me going up to somebody and saying, oh, they're doing the cursed play today. Unless you're in theater, you're probably not 100% aware of what the heck that all is referring to. Other situations are things like jargon. When students come up to me and tell me about these journal articles that are very, very hard to read, and they don't understand what the people are saying, that's usually because professors like referring to things in their academic jargon. 90% of the time, it's probably unnecessary to use jargon, but some people forget, and some people really just don't care too. There's those people as well. Or maybe some people are so out of it that so away from being a young person that's new to the field that they don't even realize that they're using jargon. There's also something to be said for if you are a person who is teaching in your field and you're only you are speaking at the level of your audience being college freshmen, college sophomores, or whatever, and you speak like that in general, a lot of your colleagues may think you're not very bright because you're not using the jargon, even though the sign of a good communicator is to understand the jargon but not necessarily communicate in it. That's actually one of the things that can make teachers much more effective, is simply just avoid the jargon if you can. However, people who are doing the writing, getting peer-reviewed publications out, sometimes reviewers judge people if they're not using all of the jargon, which is sometimes why students are having accessibility problems, shall we say. So that's another thing. When I am I have to be very mindful of my audience level, and that's even within different forms of psychology. When I communicate with the people who work in my subfield, I may accidentally move up to whoever I'm communicating with. But I try to only do that if it's like a one-on-one situation. Sometimes it is it's a bigger situation, and maybe even outside my own subfield, it's possible that people don't understand what I'm talking to. I got busted for that one time when I was talking to a mentor who was using jargon, and I just slipped into communicating with him like that, leaving my academic advisor very, very confused because he had no idea what we were saying. So you always have to be aware of your audience. You also might have to be aware of these other two things: situation models convergence, which basically means if each person has their own distinct style of speech, maybe speed or whatnot. When it comes down to stuff like that, really it turns out that people, if they're communicating, will tend to eventually, I don't want to say agree on, but certainly start to converge. A really slow speaker and a really fast speaker, they get together and attempt to communicate. They might meet halfway. So the slow speaker might speed up some, the quick speaker might slow down. That's a possibility as well. Now, as far as priming, this is a concept that's mentioned in other lectures about how one concept can remind you of related concepts. With that in mind, I have an activity coming up. So this is one of the activities. I want you to look at these words. These are actually called word stems. Quickly look at them and jot down the first words that come to mind that meet each one of those criteria. And I'll give you a few seconds for that. Okay. Hopefully you've written everything down. So look at your list. Did people happen to see these? Certainly those all meet the criteria. But so does this other batch. So the first one could be table or taboo. Could be the second chair or chant. Then desk, destiny, sofa, and soft. So the thing is when we're referring to priming, as people are looking at this tab one, and then trying to fill it in, some people might think, oh, table. Some people might think of other things. But if you're looking through this whole table, which is a very easy one to pop up with, is more likely to prime people towards stuff like furniture, chair, desk, sofa. This is actually a very interesting concept in various forms of language and communication that you guys might want to be aware of. But that's an example of priming. That table would lead to these others. While you could just as easily do table, chant, destiny, blah, 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 blah. It's just more likely to do it. Use of language. So this comic strip is kind of an interesting comic because a few years ago, this would have pretty much made absolutely no sense. I was on the internet before Twitter was a thing. There was no Vlog, Bitly. Those things simply didn't exist. If you had said something like this to me some years back, I'd have been like, no hablo español, because that's pretty much what it would have been to me. So language comes up with has two main things: this concept of the lexicon and the concept of syntax. So lexicon is those words and expressions. An example of a really kind of weird one is there's not a snowball's chance in the Arctic. All right. That's cool. I mean, that's a sentence, and the sentence is technically grammatically correct, but it doesn't make a whole heap of sense when you put it all together. Because I would imagine a snowball probably has a decent chance in the Arctic. The actual phrase, of course, as we know, is there's not a snowball's chance in hell. Because, a snowball will probably melt rather quickly in anything that's warm. So I don't know what that first one's trying to go for, but that's an example of an incorrect lexicon for the expression. Syntax, well, that comes down to the grammar. Apple crawled the worm inside. In English, that's not how you put that down. I mean, yeah, it's you can kind of understand that if you really want to, but that's not considered correct grammar. There are some languages, I'm not sure which ones all are, that would have something similar. There's at least one language where the verb is all the way at the end of the sentence. So, but different languages do have slightly different things. So that's just a thing for you guys to think about those two components. So I have a question for y'all. And that question is, well, how many languages do you speak? Most commonly in the US, one. Maybe two. Can you imagine what it would be like if you spoke?
Sasa naweza kusema ama kuelewi lugha.
I feel that language gives you something with which you can connect to another person.
अब अच्छा इस किताब के बारे में यहाँ पे लिखा है, ये किताब कुदरतुल्लाह शाह की खुद नविश्त है। एक और
नविश्त क्या है? Writer?
खुद नविश्त
was written.
About his own life.
Oh, okay. Oh, खुद नविश्त.
खुद नविश्त.
Yeah.
Each language is in many ways an expression of how one society or culture thinks. I feel that when I start to speak foreign languages, a lot of times I become a bit of a different person. Perhaps I say things that I wouldn't necessarily say in English. Perhaps I'm more deferential to others. Perhaps I'm more upfront about what I say.
Привет.
Здравствуйте, молодой человек.
Добрый день.
Добрый.
Как вас зовут?
Натан.
Натан. Это.
Тебя как зовут?
Привет. Я Тим. Тим.
Очень приятно.
Очень приятно. И откуда вы?
Polyglot is a word that comes from two Greek roots, poly and gloss, or glottis, which together means many tongues, many languages, and it just refers to anyone who speaks 3 to 4 languages or more at a pretty high level.
The term hyperpolyglot, that's the people who have a commitment to learning and maintaining a lot of languages. Most of them really put in a lot of work on it and take pride in knowing these languages.
那可以不可以养宠物？
我真的不知道。
你真的不知道？
可是如果你给我钱，你就可以。
真的吗？啊，好好好，那我得。
I'm really comfortable having a conversation on more or less any topic in French, Arabic, Hebrew, and Farsi. I think maybe a tier down would be Chinese, German, and Russian. I've done a fair amount of Latin and Greek in school, but that's obviously a different skill range for dead languages. I'm pretty comfortable speaking in languages like, Hindi or Urdu, Indonesian. With a little bit of practice, I feel, confident again in languages like Turkish, for example, or, my Italian's not so great, but I feel like I can understand it pretty well. And then there are languages that are a little bit more dormant or that I haven't studied for a while, languages such as Ojibwe or Yiddish or Wolof or Hausa, and then languages that I'm more or less a beginner in, such as Japanese and, Dutch, a couple others.
The languages that we speak as a family, it's really not that impressive. Ezra and I studied French for many, many years, so we can understand French people who are slowed down incredibly.
I lived in Hong Kong for a while. I studied Cantonese, but studying 20 hours a week for a summer, I didn't make anywhere near the progress that Tim made studying 20 hours a week, for example, Persian.
فکر میکنم که پردازش همین بخشی از یاد گرفتن فارسی فهمیدن تاریخ و فرهنگ ایران است.
In North America, we mostly learn one language as we're growing up, and that language gets to be so good that it interferes with our learning other languages. Tim Donner's talents in the American context are extremely unusual, particularly at his young age. The hyperpolyglots one tends to hear about in the world are older as a rule. So coming up with people who've started really in high school doing this, extremely rare.
Yomu.
Yominai?
Yomanai.
Yomanai.
Tim, he is passionate about learning languages, and for him, this is not just a hobby, and it's basically his way of life. He actually spends most of his waking hours learning languages.
友達に会った?
いなかった。
会わなかった。
会わなかった。
Right, so I find that most of the time when I'm starting a language, one of the most important things to do is have a lot of audio input. So I generally start out with any sort of series, and I'll try to just absorb the language as much as possible. I think by repeating to yourself over and over, it's a really good way to train.
Tim will watch movies. We've seen many movies in Farsi and movies in Arabic.
Watching TV shows or movies is really helpful in any kind of language learning because it exposes you to the normal rate of speech in a language and maybe a more colloquial register than you get in a textbook. I think it trains you also to be able to comprehend a lot more. I find that when I start a new language and I start watching TV in it, after I'm comfortable enough, maybe I'll understand 4 or 5 words out of 10. And then that really helps because that bleeds over into conversation. So I think watching TV is really the basis of learning in a lot of ways. Plus it's fun.
Bu dilden hoşlanıyorum çünkü ben de Farsça ve Arapça.
I think the internet has been absolutely crucial, for me for learning languages. Anytime I have a new language, I try to post a video of me speaking it with someone or just me delivering some kind of monologue to the camera. And the responses I get are really helpful. They show me, which direction I should go in, what I have to work on still, what I've done well, and that's fantastic.
Gigawa min minawa miigwech bizindawiye.
I think the great thing about living in New York is that you really can practice any language you want. This is arguably the most linguistically diverse spot on earth.
Est-ce que vos parents aussi parlent?
Non, malheureusement, non. Et ils ont pris français à l'école, mais non, ils parlent seulement anglais.
Vous êtes un génie, monsieur.
C'est pas vrai.
Oui, c'est ça. Parlant. Parler 20 langues? Ce pouvoir communiquer avec toute cette langue? Oh mon Dieu, c'est fantastique.
Merci.
For me, there are plenty of things that are fascinating about languages. Primarily, it's the fact that, as a bit of a history nerd, you can see in any language the entire history of a people and its interactions with others. For a while, when I was around 12 and 13, I had a very big interest in learning about the Middle East, especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I thought that by learning a language, I might be able to break through the wall that's been built around it. A little bit after my bar mitzvah when I was 13, I started to teach myself Hebrew.
עברית הייתה השפה הראשונה שלמדתי אחרי אנגלית. אני התחלתי ללמוד לפני שנה וחצי.
After I learned Hebrew, I thought that, I maybe would be quite successful in teaching myself languages. So after that, I decided to try Arabic to get the other half of the equation in the history of the Middle East.
بس يعني كمان كيف العلاقات بين المسيحيين والمسلمين في مصر دلوقتي؟
لا ما كانش كويس مش كويس عامة مش كويس.
وحتى اليوم. I feel that by studying languages, by looking at their development, by looking at what's old and what's new, you gain a greater appreciation for society's values and for just its entire history. It's something that's a little bit hard to communicate and may sound a bit disingenuous, but that's sort of the breakthrough that I had in studying it. There's this idea that seems to circulate, which is completely false, that Americans don't like learning about other cultures, Americans don't like learning foreign languages.
Alors, Manuel, c'était vachement un plaisir de faire votre connaissance.
Moi aussi, monsieur.
I hope that, I can do my part to disprove that.
Et j'espère que vous parlez plusieurs mots, d'addition de plusieurs langues.
Exactement. Alors, la langue prochaine, le créole.
Oh, ouais, oui.
Au revoir.
Au revoir, monsieur.
I think if you raise people with other languages, you open them up to foreign cultures, to foreign ideas. And again, in the future, in a world that's increasingly globalized, you give them, a solid opportunity for more connections as they grow older. There's a quote from Nelson Mandela, which goes something like, if you talk to a man in his second language, you're talking to his brain. If you talk to him in his mother language, you're talking to his heart.
आप इसी तरह से मेहनत करते रहें, इंशाल्लाह आप बहुत आगे बढ़ेंगे और मुझे बहुत उम्मीद है तुमसे और मैं बहुत खुश हूँ इस लैंग्वेज को चुना है और अल्लाह तुम्हें कामयाब खुदा हाफिज Thank you very much.
I'm Tim وأنتم بتتفرجوا على Thinker. أنتم مستقلين Thinker. على Thinker نگاه میکنید. Ni men känns jag kan Thinker. Hava.
I am absolutely fascinated by this guy and his ability to learn his 20 languages. I can barely manage the one I actually have. So, like I said, completely fascinated by that guy. Really, really jealous too. And now we get to the content of language. And it probably should come as no surprise to really anyone that the topics of conversation do tend to float around various forms of social things, such as in-group and out-group. We're really interested in being able to identify who's part of our in-group, the people we are that we are, a part of, related to or affiliated with, however you want to say that, and who is the outside group that maybe we really don't want to have nearly as much attention paid to them. This is really, really important. We use language to sit there and make the outsiders even more outside. Example can be the looking at World War II. In the in-group for World War II in Germany were the various Aryans. They used language which the Jews could understand. I mean, they could understand German that were living there, but they used various other phrases to further divide us versus them. They would call the Jews all sorts of different degrading names, dogs, pigs, all that other stuff, to further emphasize that that they're not human, subhuman, etc. The American history doesn't exactly have a good track record with that either. We've got so many racial slurs that are not necessary to have, but that is an in-group, out-group thing, at least partially. Of course, to a much bigger extreme, in-group, out-group can literally keep people outside. If you look at something like the language called Polari, Polari, that is an artificial language. It borrows it from several languages. That was actually the language of the gay community for a number of years. It hasn't quite died out, but you don't see that many Polari speakers anymore. But that was used to be able to identify who it was okay to talk to, especially back then when being LGBT was a really bad thing and was illegal. But that's one of those in-group, out-group things. Also, of course, topics of conversation is simply stuff like gossiping. Gossiping can further say, okay, that's us versus them. Okay, do you know what blankety blank did the other day? Oh, well, that's not appropriate. You know, she's obviously not that she obviously shouldn't be a part of our group. That type of thing. You know, there's of course more than that, but those are just very, very basic ideas as to, you know, content and language and what goes on. Linguistic intergroup bias, you know, it's simply stuff about, you know, positive about your own group, negative towards the others. That can also kind of go in with this in-group, out-group thing. The Aryans always thought they were great, the Jews not so much. But there is certainly that aspect, you know, as well. They didn't think the Jews were great, you know. But man, could the Nazis talk well about themselves. Content of language also includes going back to this social brain hypothesis that there's this evolutionary advantage towards having a larger brain, and that we're using all this to, the language may make part of this a little bit easier to manage. Now, you know, this whole thing really does focus on the social material. All that is more advantageous to survival, and it might make it easier. Originally, the brain could only hold maybe only hold 150 social relationships. Now it's like 400 or something. That's something that the anthropologists have been throwing at us. Whether that's accurate or not, I don't really know. But the more social and language develops, maybe the bigger our brains have to get, and then it's this feedback loop where, okay, bigger brains, now we can process more information, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. The language also has this conveys a sense of permanency and stability as various traits. This allows us to better describe other people, others' roles, etc. It also, I mean, that's at least the stability and trait part. But permanency also, with written language, with oral language, whatever, it's much easier to write stuff down, pass it on, something that's important enough to keep. When you guys leave my class, or they leave this lecture, stop the video, whatever, you probably have lost 90% of it. But, and 90% of what I'm saying. But if you took notes, maybe you'll remember a little bit more. So those are at least a few examples of that area too. There's actually a lot more examples, but those are at least a few. This concept of social networks. Social networks, that's been around since before Facebook and all those crazy things that we have. And that is it's really is this chain of communication that goes on. Like, I don't have to be necessarily speaking to my little social group. I could just as easily get information passed on to one person and have them pass it on to another student and another student and another student. You know, basically beware of gossiping, because one thing saying one thing can just be passed on, and just saying one thing can get up to a very wide amount of people, very broad amount of people. So that's just basically that example as well. It's just that chain of communication. Psychology of language use. A lot of people in this class are probably therapists or going to go into therapists or whatever. And it's very interesting how the first two things really make us certainly feel better about what's going on. They have found that like for the labeling of emotions, just labeling things lead to neural changes. That includes if you have a negative emotion situation going on, just saying I'm angry, I'm scared, I'm whatever. The amygdala, which tends to process a whole lot of those negative emotions, it actually gets activated less, which is pretty much amazing when you really think about that. Healing with language. For those who are going to be therapistic, y'all are going to have some patients going to wander into your office and quite frankly find out that you don't have to say a damn thing before they go and they show up, then they just talk to you. And sooner or later, your therapeutic hour is going to be over, and quite frankly, you might not have said more than a few words. And they'll just come in and say, oh, I feel so much better. Because sometimes just communicating to another person really, really helps the healing process. So, improved memory and decision making. So interesting. There's a lot of interesting things that can happen with language. First, of course, improved memory. Well, if you write things down enough, you'll hopefully move stuff from your short term to your longer term memory. So there's that type of improved memory. Like I said, most people are going to forget this lecture anyway. But you can write things down for future reference, so you don't have to memorize everything at all times. There's also a situation where it can also help improve your decision making. While yeah, you can certainly access stuff like the things you wrote down, but if you're able to communicate with another person, you can get their opinion, so you're not just reliant on your own situation. You can take what they say into account. If so I've been, I'm of course always have my own personal issues, and I asked other people for advice. I'm hoping one day that somebody's going to give me something that it can actually pass on. But that's certainly is trying to help influence my various decision-making processes. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, basically that whole concept is that language influences cognition. You can also say that cognition influences language as well, too. But that's usually what that is based on. Now, there are other things that have not been as well studied that suggests that things like neurolinguistic programming, which is literally trying to take that to an extreme, though there's not a lot of evidence to support that part. If you want to learn more about this hypothesis, is Sapir-Whorf, just go on to YouTube. There's, I'm sure, several things out there. If you also want to look for neurolinguistic programs, you can look on that for YouTube too. So there's also, going back to this next section, cultural differences. Cultures use language differently. For example, in certain groups, there is no strong concept of pronouns. I believe Japanese is one of them. They don't really use pronouns very frequently. And that's easily explained because they're also a very collectivist nation. In contrast, look at Americans. I. We're also very individualist. But sometimes you can learn an awful lot about cultures just from their language and how they are able to do all of this other stuff as well, with how they think, how their word choices. There are a lot of words also, for example, that are not really present in English, and don't worry, English is going to try and adopt them and steal them anyway. That is very more typical of the culture in which they originally come from. So So that you could write entire papers on how cultures use language. There are probably PhDs in them, in something along those lines. Maybe ethno-linguistics, I suppose. So anyway, here's some discussion questions. So what evidence could one have that two babies could be communicating and not just simply making noise? How do you think language affects our psychology and vice versa? What about the language of persuasion? And what are some common topics of conversation that you find yourself participating in with friends and family? What do you think the most common subject of everyday conversation is? Also, how might language help people be psychologically healthier? Of course, if you guys have any questions at all, you can feel free to drop a line, comment, question, whatever you want to do, and I will get back to it as soon as I can. Bye.